Hi everybody, and welcome to this first video where we're just going to explain what you're going to be learning about in this unit. And over the next few videos in this first week, I'm going to be explaining the core ideas that we are going to be learning about and how they relate to your assessment. And the first thing that we need to establish is the way that we're going to approach media research in this unit, which is to consider, in a very broad sense, how media make distinct contributions to social reality. The essential point that we're going to explore throughout the unit is the idea that although media don't cause things in direct ways, the world that we live in takes on a particular form in relation to media. That is, the world that we live in wouldn't be the same if we didn't have access to certain kinds of media technologies, and if we didn't live in a public culture that wasn't so dependent on media industries. So what we're going to do is a few things. I suppose two big ideas that we're going to be exploring this week. The biggest one is learning to understand how we can say that media are reality, that the way that media tells stories, that the way that media encourage us to use particular technologies, all of these things have particular impacts on our world. And we also want to understand what it means to approach that question from a critical perspective. So we're going to be talking about what it means to research media reality from a critical point of view. And then I'm just going to be going over some more guidelines about telling you a little bit more about the content of the unit. So at the end of the 3 or 4 videos that I'm going to do this week, you should have a pretty firm sense of what we're going to do and the sorts of topics that we're going to cover. So the first thing I want you to think about is thinking about how media have played a role in your life. That's a really good way to begin to think about the kinds of questions that we're going to explore here. One of the things that we're going to pick up on very quickly is the idea that the things that you've experienced in relation to media are a research resource, that your own experiences with media are a really good place to start thinking about how media have an effect on the social world. And I want to start off with a spectacular example. The picture that you see in front of you is actually a picture of a media academic called John Tullock. And John Tullock is a very well-respected and widely cited media researcher who's been researching the impact of media on social life for many, many decades. But the picture that you see in front of you is John Tullock as he's being led from the London Underground following a terrorist attack on London on July the 7th, 2005, the 7/7 attacks. John Tullock was on a train that was and was sitting opposite a suicide bomber who exploded a bomb, and Tullock miraculously escaped. And it's a tragic but also a very interesting story, because John Tullock had been spending a lot of his career writing very critically about how media represent the world, how media, when media represent the world in particular ways, that those representations have particular effects on how people see the world and how people act in the world. And to John Tulloch's horror, he found his picture. So he was photographed by news journalists as he emerged from the London Underground. And his picture was one of many pictures that was used to really stir up anger amongst the British reading public in favour of immediate retaliations against forces in the Middle East. And Tulloch was of the opinion that the very last thing that terrorism needed, the very last thing that was likely to be an effective deterrent to terror, was further military action. Now, whether or not you believe that is neither here nor there, but that was Tulloch's point of view, and so he was very upset to see his image being used to represent an idea that he vehemently opposed. And this was kind of interesting to Tulloch because he kind of, after many years of writing about media representation, he found himself a victim, I guess, of misrepresentation. And what he actually ended up doing was writing a book about what had happened to him and how his particular image had been, how his existence, how his life, how he as a person and everything he stood for had been misrepresented in the media to produce all kinds of political ends that he really, really objected to. Now, this is a pretty spectacular example. It's not, I hope you've never had an experience like this, but it actually followed a certain pattern in Tulloch's career. If you read through his career as a whole, he had frequently drawn on his own experiences to try and make sense of how media work in the world, how media make a difference. So this is quite interesting because quite often we think that our own experiences really have nothing to do with media research, but that's really not how things work in media studies. That it's not. I'm not saying that you can be a good media researcher just by writing your own biography, by producing autobiographical accounts of things that have happened to you in relation to media. But it is to say that if you can think about your own media experiences, it's a really good place to start to at least think about how media affect the world. So that's one of the first things that I want you to think about. So what are you here to do? Well, in an academic sense, you're here to really demonstrate that you understand what it means to say that media make reality. Very often we think that media is just entertainment or just misrepresentation, just fake news, whatever it is. But media are an active part of our social world and they direct our social world in a particular direction. So you need to understand what it means to say that. And within that, you need to learn how to do significant, valid media research that addresses that process. You need to do research that really demonstrates how media push our social existence in particular directions. Now, what that means fundamentally, the most important research method you will learn is learning how to ask a researchable question. What this means is being able to recognize the sorts of research questions which you can actually answer with the time and the resources that you have available to you. So one of the skills we're going to be learning, and this is really important for your progression as a student, is learning how to identify a research question that you can do by accessing a method that also is something that you can execute. And you need to learn to recognize, when I say a valid case study, you need to recognize where we can see examples of media influence in action. Now, a really great way to learn how to do all of this is to learn how to read existing media research critically. That is, you need to learn from other media researchers. When you're trying to figure out how to do media research, it's really good to be able to look at other research that's been published and say, well, how did they do that? And that's something that we're going to be focusing in on. One of the big tips I really want to tell you is try and be original. Try and educate me. Try and do some research on something that I don't know about. Tell me something I don't know. And, that might sound daunting, but you can do it. As students, you've lived through some really momentous changes in media environments and their impact on the social world. And your insights onto what it's felt to live through these experiences are a place where you can begin to do research and reach out to other people who've been through those same experiences. So think about what you've observed and think about how you can apply that to research methods. But the other thing is, think about what you care about. Why are you interested in the media? Why do you want to know about media research? That, again, is a really important question to ask yourself. And then the final thing we're going to be doing, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later, is we're going to be learning about a particular process for doing media research. And that process kind of runs as follows. So the first thing is that we need to understand how media have a reality effect. And the place to begin that exploration is through observation. What do you notice in the social world today about places where people think that media are doing something to society? And then we begin to unpack that. We begin to say, well, okay, let's look at why the news media or social commentators are talking about this media effect. What is it that they care about? What is it they're worried about? What is it they're hopeful about? And then we compare that with media research. What do media researchers say about this topic? And what you'll find most often is that media researchers quite often think that a particular topic is socially important for a range of reasons which are really quite different to the ones that are identified by public commentators. And then quite often when we're exploring this research, we will find an approach that really seems to make sense to us, that we understand, that we like, that we think we can replicate. And so what we need to do is we need to find a kind of a media role model, someone whose research and whose methods and whose ideas we can use to guide the things that we want to do. Then we're going to be picking a method for doing some media research. And finally, we're going to be writing a media research proposal that really focuses on explaining the significance of the research that we want to do. Why does society need our research? And this is a really important professional skill. This is something you're going to be judged on in the workplace. So that's an overview of what we're going to be doing. And in the next videos, I'm just going to be breaking down the idea of media reality in a bit more depth.